Okay, so there are a lot of different ways that we talk about our speech acts and mental states, many of which are really familiar in the philosophical literature. So for example, there's direct discourse, as in Ellen said, quote, "I'm leaving now," or I asked, quote, "Are you leaving?" Direct discourse, you quote the thing that was said or the thing that was thought. There's also indirect discourse, as in Ellen said that she would leave, or I asked whether she was leaving. I believe that everyone should go home, and so on. Now, these direct discourse and indirect discourse constructions have had a huge amount of attention in the philosophical literature, also in the linguistic literature, and in lots of areas of psychology. I did a little search and I found, thousands of papers on belief and desire and knowledge and things like that. But interestingly, there's a way that we have of talking about our speech acts and mental states that's received virtually no attention in the philosophical literature, and very little attention in the linguistic literature as well. And this is quotative be-like. So these are examples like, Ellen was like, "I'm leaving now," or Akira was like, "Everyone should go home." These examples are, as I say, neglected. I haven't been able to find any philosophical literature on this issue. There's a bit in sociolinguistics, but that's about it. But they're interesting and important for a couple of reasons. One is that they're really common. So a lot of this sociolinguistic research shows that quotative be-like is the most common quotative expression in many dialects of English. So it's more common than things like says or thinks, and also more common than things like believes. I have this quote here from one paper that says, "Regardless of age, Canadian youth rarely use anything other than be-like." So it's this really common thing. It's also common in other languages. It seems to have spread to many languages from English. So many Northern European languages have relatively recent analogs of Qbl. You see these in Scandinavian languages, German, Dutch, but also languages like Hebrew and Japanese. And then some languages have other kind of related quotative expressions that aren't derived from the English. The last time I gave a version of this paper, somebody was talking to me about Romanian and the quotative system in Korean. So if anyone has other examples, I'd be glad for more data. But anyway, it's a very, very common, in some ways, maybe the most common way we talk about our own minds, our own speech acts. The other interesting thing about it, and the reason why some sociolinguists are interested in it, is that it seems relatively new. It first turns up in the linguistics literature in 1982, and corpus studies don't see it before the 1980s. And also, the sociolinguistic literature focuses on the distribution of this locution by age, and they find this is mostly kind of in the early 2000s. I think this may have shifted since then, but at that time, it was mostly younger speakers, like teenagers, who were using it. So that again suggests that it's this kind of new thing. But since then, just in the past 40 years, it again has spread to other languages and become sort of the most common way we talk about our minds. And now, this is interesting in itself, but what we really want to show here is that it's particularly interesting because Qbl is importantly different from direct discourse and indirect discourse. And it provides a kind of novel expressive resource for talking about ourselves. So we're going to try and motivate that claim in the first few sections here. And then in the second part of the talk, we'll talk about some theoretical options for explaining what's going on with Qbl. without, I must say, arriving at a very satisfactory or conclusive kind of conclusion. I should say, by the way, when I say we here, I'm talking about myself and Andreas Stokke, who is who I've been working with on this project. Right, so let's start out by looking at some of the basic features of Qbl. So one thing that is quite obvious about Qbl is that it's informal. It's not the kind of thing that you would see in an academic paper. It's not the kind of thing that you would see in a judicial verdict. It's not the kind of thing that it's even that common to see written down, except perhaps as a kind of record of, verbatim record of what someone said. Now, we don't think that this is a particularly significant feature of Qbl. In fact, as we're going to suggest, Qbl has interesting features that would make it useful even in more formal kinds of situations. So we're not going to focus on this informality. It's also the case that although you wouldn't see Qbl in a judicial verdict, you would hear judges using it outside of their written verdict. So even in a kind of interview, if you listen to podcasts where they interview historians and politicians and things like that, they use Qbl all the time, even though they wouldn't use it in more official kinds of contexts. Okay, so set aside the informality. Now here's an important point that may go some way towards explaining some of this informality. I think in a lot of people's minds, Qbl is linked to another use of the word like, which is the use as a discourse particle. It's sometimes called focuser like. I'll talk about that in a second. So this is examples like the examples I have in 4. I was like so tired, or he was wearing this like very pink shirt. I think she like doesn't care. Now, that's another kind of informal way of talking associated with particular communities. It's different though, it's a little bit hard to say exactly what's contributed by discourse particle like. But one kind of view that makes good sense of a lot of these cases is that like is giving information about focus. So this is telling you something like what's new about this information, like marking the information that's new in the discourse. Now, how can you detect the use of like as a discourse particle? Well, one thing is, because it's only communicating something about information structure, about focus, it doesn't seem to communicate something, it doesn't seem to contribute to what is said or to the proposition expressed or the truth conditions of the utterance. So you can say, I was like so tired. And it makes perfectly good sense and communicates essentially the same thing to say just, I was so tired. So discourse particle like is omittable without significant loss to what's communicated, as in the examples in 4', but that's not the case for Qbl. So you can say Ellen was like, I'm leaving now, but if you omit the like, you get Ellen was, I'm leaving now. And that's just ungrammatical, it doesn't make sense. So in these quotative be-like constructions, like is doing something more than in the discourse particle use, or something different, at least, than in the discourse particle use. Okay. Now here's a further kind of interesting feature of be-like. It's closely linked to quotation. So whereas many verbs of direct discourse can take either a quotation, as in Ellen said, quote, I'm leaving now, or a that clause, or embedded question, as in Ellen said that she was leaving. Be like isn't like that. So it can only take a quotation and it can't take a that clause or embedded question. So you can't say Ellen was like that she was leaving, or I was like whether she was leaving. And in fact, although there are other verbs of direct discourse, such as utter, that have something like these features. So Ellen uttered, or Ellen uttered the sentence, "I'm leaving now," is fine. Ellen uttered that she was leaving is pretty bad. But with these kind of words, you can still refer to the thing that she uttered in some other way that's not just quoting it. So you could say something like, Ellen uttered that sentence, or Ellen uttered every magic word that came into her head. And those make good sense, even though you're not quoting all of the magic words or the sentence that she uttered. You're referring to that sentence, to those words, in some other way. An interesting thing about QBL is that you can't do that. So you can't say, Ellen was like that sentence, demonstrating the sentence, or Ellen was like the sentence that was written on the board. Everyone was like their favorite sentence. Those sound terrible and don't make sense. So QBL requires quotation in a much stronger way than other kind of verbs of direct discourse. Now, I think that this is a really super interesting feature of QBL. Unfortunately, it's something that I'm not going to have a lot to say about. The only real explanations I can think of for this feature are either syntactic or typological. So they have to do with the kind of syntactic features or semantic types of quotations and be like. I don't really have anything very interesting to say about those. It would be interesting if somebody could do more to explain this feature more than we're going to do in this paper. So something to keep in mind, I guess. Okay, so, and one other thing I should say is that I'm going to give a caveat to this claim that QBL requires quotation in the next section. That's, to a first approximation, it requires quotation, but there's a very interesting kind of exception to that, or possible exception to that we're going to go on to discuss. Maybe I should just pause there and see if anyone wants to ask a question. If not, oh, so Simon?
This isn't so much a question as a possible suggestion. So should I leave it until later, or do you want it now?
I don't know.
Right. Feel free to ignore it and move on if you want that. I was put in mind of a theory Donald Davidson had about back clauses, that they actually demonstrate the thing that comes afterwards. So Simon believed that it is raining. So there's a thing, it is raining, Simon believed that. And I just wondered if like might, I mean, whether Davidson's right or not about that, whether like might serve a similar purpose. And one little bit of evidence for that might be the fact that what follows like can sometimes be a sort of performance. I was like, oh, you know, it doesn't have to be an utterance, but it can be.
Yeah, very good. So this is that is precisely the modification to the claim that QBL requires quotation that we're going to go on to discuss. So that is a really important point, I think.
It would help explain why it requires quotation, why you can't say things like Ellen was like that she was leaving, because it would be as though you had two demonstratives then, at least if Davidson's theory was right.
That's interesting, right? Yeah, that's interesting. I guess it wouldn't. Well, yeah, that's interesting. So there is one kind of view here that is discussed or defended by a linguist, sort of confusingly named Catherine Davidson, on which the object of these be-like locutions and other kinds of direct discourse as well is what she calls a demonstration, and she motivates this both by mentioning the kind of data that you've just alluded to, and also by talking about some examples from sign languages and things like that. I think that's interesting. I guess I'm a little bit unclear myself as to exactly what a demonstration is in this context. I don't think anyone has given a very good account of that, but it does seem like that's at least a promising strategy to investigate. So I'll talk more, maybe I'll hold this thought and I'll talk more about some related things in a few minutes. And if we get to the end, and maybe we can revisit it then. Gareth?
It was, I don't know, you might want me to wait to the end. It was really just more about the that thing. And the reason it sort of popped in my head is because where I come from in Scotland, down in Ayrshire, we quite often say, and I was like that. And you sort of perform a reaction you had. You're sort of referring to yourself in the past. You might perform a reaction to something that happened then. You'll make a facial expression. Or you'll say, she was like that. Or you might use words, say, she was like that, I'm off. But she just physically left. And I wasn't sure if that's of any interest. Or...
No, that is really interesting. Yeah. So it seems like you can... yeah, that's a good point. So it does... So I think you can't... so it could be true that Ellen was like, I'm leaving. Mm-hmm. But if I'm leaving is the sentence written on the board, it doesn't follow from that Ellen was like the sentence written on the board, or Ellen was like that sentence. Those all sound pretty bad to me. But I agree, even outside of Ayrshire, you can do Ellen was like that. And that's maybe not so. That's better. So yeah, that bears some thoughts. Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, so there are some interesting related constructions here. Apparently, it's common in the London dialects to say, this is me, I'm out of here, or this is me, and that's obviously a related kind of construction to I was like, and it may be that the I was like this is kind of bringing some of these things together. But yeah, I agree. That's interesting, and it does. I mean, it makes the. I think I think whatever explains this kind of requirement, such if you want to call it that, of quotation, is going to have to be complicated. I'm not quite sure what to do about that, but that's a really good observation. Right, okay. Good. Okay. Okay, so if you look up like on Wikipedia, you will find that it does report on Qbl. It does mention Qbl, and the kind of account that it gives there is that it is a kind of loose way of reporting speech. So there's this kind of feature where if you say she was like, I'm leaving, that suggests that maybe she didn't exactly say verbatim the words, quote, I'm leaving, but she said something to that effect. So there's a kind of roughness to Qbl, at least according to many people. Now it's worth noting that that's also true of says. We often get away with direct discourse reports that don't verbatim repeat the very words that the person uttered. So it's a little bit unclear as to what extent Qbl is different from that. But anyway, let's just take as a target to, I think not, well, let's just take as a target to start out with the claim that I have as Qbl it says here on the handout under 2, X was like S is true if and only if X said S. Now, set aside this looseness feature for a second. I think nothing in the ballpark of this can really be right. So to start out with, it's plausible, I think, that the right to left direction of this claim is often or perhaps always true. So if you say S, then it's typically, again, maybe always going to be true to report you as being like S. But the left to right direction is often false. So here's an example. Suppose Ellen is watching a movie alone and feels annoyed at the soundtrack. She could truly report her state the next day using sentence 6, even if she remains silent during the movie. I was watching, so 6 is, I was watching this movie last night and I was like, God, this soundtrack is so annoying. So I think it's true, or it might be true, that she was like, God, this soundtrack is so annoying, even if she didn't say anything at all. She was by herself, she wasn't talking. Okay, so Qbl is as says can't be quite right. Now you might think this just means Qbl is a bit more flexible, so it need not report just speech acts, but can also report other direct discourse kind of things like thinking. So this is the claim we have as Qbl as DD. X was like S is true if and only if X said or thought S. So you might think in this Ellen situation, she has to at least think something along the lines of, God, this soundtrack is so annoying. Okay. But a problem with this is the problem that Simon already pointed out, that Qbl ascriptions, unlike most direct discourse constructions, can use gestures. So here are some examples. When I heard what Trump said, I was like, when you see him after his recital, just be like, do you think she'll be like, okay. Now, that seems different than says. You can't replace I was like with I said in those examples. Like when I heard what Trump said, I said, that is pretty bad, doesn't seem to make any sense. But you might think there is a response available to the proponent of something like Qbl is DD. And this is to claim that what we need to do in these cases is to paraphrase away the gesture. So an example like 7a is roughly equivalent to, when I heard what Trump said, I thought, that's stupid. Now, it's hard to kind of decisively refute a strategy like this without knowing more about the rules of paraphrase and how this is all supposed to work. But I think there are some reasons to doubt that anything like this is going to work. So one kind of reply to this paraphrase response would be to claim that there are some gestures that just can't be adequately paraphrased. There are some gestures that can't be sort of captured in words in this way. And I think that's probably plausible, although I don't know how to give a precise kind of defense of it. Another kind of reply would be, there's still something important that remains to be explained here. And that would be, why do we paraphrase be like when we don't paraphrase with said? So it seems like if the gesture can be paraphrased as that's stupid, it should be totally legitimate to say, when I heard what Trump did, I said, that should be paraphrasable in just the same way. But it isn't. So it looks like paraphrase can't be what's going on here, or at least we need some independent reason to think that we can paraphrase in Qbl context, but we can't paraphrase in says and thinks contexts, and it's not clear to me what a reason like that is going to look like. Okay, so I think these simple attempts to explain away QBL in terms of says and thinks won't work. QBL has some distinct features that aren't just reducible to says and thinks in this kind of simple, straightforward way. But there are fancier kinds of ways that you might try to give an account of QBL in terms of other direct discourse locutions. So one idea that you might have here in thinking about these kind of cases is like, so maybe Ellen didn't say, God, the soundtrack is so annoying. But there was something about her state at the time she was reporting that would have made it appropriate to say that. Like, she was in a mental state that kind of is the kind of state that causes people to say, God, that's so annoying. And something that's kind of what this QBL report is gesturing at. Okay, so there's something plausible about that thought, I think. I think there are different ways you might try to develop it, and I want to consider two I want to focus on two in some detail here. So one would have it that QBL is reporting a kind of disposition. S was like S is true if and only if X was disposed to say S, if S is a sentence, or to make S, if S is a gesture, in suitably related circumstances. So this isn't requiring you to actually have said S, although it would seem to encompass, to incorporate those kind of cases where you do actually say S. That's not required, but what is required is that you have some kind of disposition to say S. Another proposal, closely related, maybe the same if you have a certain kind of, I think currently not so popular view of dispositions. X was like S is true if and only if, under some suitably related circumstances, X would have said S if S is a sentence, or made S if S is a gesture. So again, this isn't requiring you to have said S in fact, it's only for you to be such that under the right circumstances, you would have said S. Okay, now I think these are promising. They handle the kind of cases that we have discussed so far. And they handle some other possible objections as well. So one fact about QBL, I think, is that we often use it with non-linguistic kinds of entities. So we can say things like, then my cat was like, I'm out of here. And the direct discourse kind of versions of QBL it seems like that's a kind of problem here. And it seems like it's a problem for these dispositional and counterfactual claims as well, because presumably cats are never disposed to say, I'm out of here. But I think that objection is inconclusive. You can make the case that what's going on in these sentences involves a kind of pretense. What we're suggesting is something like, let's pretend cats can talk. Then my cat is in a state that would dispose it to say, I'm out of here. Something along those lines. We're familiar with these kind of phenomena involving pretense in natural language, and this looks like it could be one of them. So I think these kind of cases aren't a decisive objection to these views. Likewise, there's this phenomenon that we call metonymic QBL, because it's related to the linguistic device of metonymy. So you can say, Al Capone grabbed the gun and he was like, pow, pow, bang. And you're not suggesting there that he said pow, pow, bang, or that he was disposed to say pow, pow, bang, or anything like that. What you're suggesting is that he shot the gun. Likewise, Ellen jumped on the motorcycle and she was like, vroom, zoom. Okay, so again, that looks like a problem for any attempt to reduce Qbl to direct discourse locutions. And maybe there is a problem here, but again, I think this isn't decisive. It looks like you could give an account of what's going on here by claiming that these examples are kind of non-literal speech. So for example, if you were kind of Gricean, you might say, what's going on here is that when you say Al Capone was like pow, pow, bang, you're flouting the maxim of quality, because what you're saying is obviously false. Obviously, Al Capone wasn't disposed to say pow, pow, bang. And so your audience is going to engage in this kind of reasoning and try and figure out what you're trying to get at instead of that. And plausibly, you're gesturing at something he was doing rather than something he was saying. Lots of details to be filled in there. Also, interesting question why this works better with Qbl than with says or thinks. But nonetheless, I think there's at least a plausible kind of story about how a proponent of these kind of views could resist these kind of objections. There's another objection that I think is a little bit better here. This is the objection from irony. I'm also inclined to think, I think that the data here is interesting but subtle. So I'm also not inclined to think that this is an absolutely knockdown objection, but there is a kind of data point here that I think is worth bearing in mind. And this is how Qbl works with irony. Suppose that on Monday, Ellen ironically says, "Oh yeah, I love haggis." Then I think Ellen's state can't be reported on Tuesday with a sentence like 10. Yesterday, Ellen was like, "I don't like haggis." Okay. Now, that's surprising from the point of view of Qbl as disposition or Qbl as counterfactual, since presumably Ellen doesn't like haggis. That's why she was being ironic. And if she doesn't like haggis, and she's an English speaker and all that, presumably she is disposed to say, "I don't like haggis" in related circumstances. So it's at least not clear that that these views, Qbl as disposition or Qbl as counterfactual, can adequately handle this objection from irony. I do think that this is a fairly subtle data point. So it's not clear to me how much one would really want to rest on it. But that is at least, that seems to me like a problem with these kind of views. I think there are other kinds of problems as well. And these problems stem from the fact that Qbl as disposition and Qbl as counterfactual are effectively behaviorist kind of views. So they're trying to give an account of this Qbl, the thing that's reported by Qbl, in terms of certain dispositions to behave. But there are these kind of famous traditional objections to behaviorist style views that I think apply here as well. If you ever took Intro to Philosophy of Mind kind of class, you probably encountered Putnam's super Spartans. These were people who were trained to not display pain behavior, and perhaps to not even be disposed to display pain behavior. And Putnam argued that because they might nonetheless feel pain, behaviorist attempts to reduce the feeling of pain to dispositions to behave weren't going to work. So likewise, I think we can imagine monks who take a vow of silence, and their training is so deeply ingrained that they no longer have any disposition, no longer feel any inclination to speak. Now, I think it still might be true to say of such a monk that he was like, "I'm out of here." But that's a problem for Qbl as disposition, because if their training is good enough, I think they might no longer have any disposition to say anything, and in particular, not to say, I'm out of here. Likewise, I think it need not be true of such a monk that he would have said, I'm out of here. So this is a problem for Qbl as counterfactual as well. Here's a different kind of case. Suppose you're being hunted by a ferocious tiger and are hiding in the closet. You know that it's crucial to be as silent as possible. It might be true of you to say that you're like, I want to live, but I don't think you'd be disposed to say, I want to live, and nor would you say this or say anything in similar circumstances, because you know how crucial it is to be as silent as possible. Okay, so those look like counterexamples to Qbl as disposition and Qbl as counterfactual. But I think you might try to modify Qbl as disposition, at least, to accommodate these kind of examples. So here's a possible response. Qbl as disposition 2. X was like S is true if and only if X was disposed to say or think S, if S is a sentence, or make S if S is a gesture in suitably related circumstances. So we're making an analogous move here to the move we made in the previous section from Qbl as says to Qbl as direct discourse by introducing the possibility that you merely think and don't say the thing. I think that is good as far as it goes, but it doesn't answer related counterexamples that focus on gesture. So imagine that instead of taking a vow of silence, the monks take a vow of stillness. I guess that's not medically possible, but presumably it's at least metaphysically possible. But you know, a monk who took a vow of stillness that was so ingrained that they never felt any disposition to move might nonetheless be like, ah! And I think likewise, you can suppose instead of being hunted by a tiger, you're being hunted by a T-Rex, who at least in the movie Jurassic Park can only see you if you move. You might be like, ah! But nonetheless, you wouldn't be disposed to do this. You would be disposed to be as still as possible. Okay, so I think that response doesn't work. There is another possible response here, motivated by the kind of vagueness by which we have stated the views under consideration. And in particular, the imprecision of the notion of suitably related circumstances. So somebody might try to claim that the dispositions in question are present, but are masked by some other fact, perhaps analogously to the way that the disposition of a fragile glass to shatter when struck might be masked by being packed in styrofoam. So, you know, a fragile glass is the kind of thing that if you strike it, it will break. But if you pack it the right way, it won't break, even if you strike it. And it may be that somebody would try to claim something similar about these kind of scenarios. So the disposition to say, I'm out of here, is still present even in the monks, no matter how good their training. It's just becomes really thoroughly masked by that training. Now, I think this is a possible move, and it's hard to know exactly how to respond to it. Likewise, I should say with the Qbl as counterfactual, depending on how you cash out the notion of suitably related circumstances, if you allow circumstances in which the monk is released from his vows or never took the vows in the first place, or et cetera, then you might get to a situation in which he would say, I'm out of here. But I don't think, so I find this kind of response difficult to evaluate without a kind of precise account of what we're to make of suitably related circumstances or how dispositions can be masked and so on. But I think there's another kind of objection, again, based on a famous kind of objection to behaviorism that shows that even this possible response won't work, or at least it's hard to see exactly how it is going to work. Right. So sorry, I think I've taken things slightly out of order to how they come on the handout. But I'll come back to the Chisholm style point in a second. So the response I have in mind, it has to do with the possibility of non-occurrent beliefs. So I think we all believe most or all of the time that 2 + 2 = 4, and that giraffes have necks, and lots of other obvious things that we never bother to put into words. I don't think it's true to say of most of us, most of the time, that we were like 2 + 2 = 4. But that seems like a problem for this strategy of being careful about suitably related circumstances. And it seems like a problem because what the proponent of that kind of strategy will need to do is to give an account of suitably related circumstances that rules in circumstances in which monks are released from their vows and you come to believe that tigers can't hear and things like that, but rules out circumstances in which someone asks you, do giraffes have necks? Or it becomes relevant for some reason to say giraffes have necks, and so on. I just don't see any way of doing this. It's hard, again, it's hard to be sure how to rule it out conclusively, but it just looks like a pretty ad hoc kind of strategy. Okay. There's one other kind of objection here that bears on these kind of views, again, based on a traditional kind of objection to behaviorism. And this is the objection that's associated with Roderick Chisholm from his book, Perceiving. So Chisholm pointed out that behavior is not typically determined by a single mental state on its own. Instead, it seems like it's kind of your whole mental state in total, or anyway, a big range of your mental states that determines your behavior. And this is a problem for the behaviorist because the behaviorist wanted to give a kind of analysis of what it is to believe that it's raining in terms of things you might do, like take an umbrella, put on a raincoat, etc., right? But what Chisholm is suggesting is, well, it's just not true that everyone who believes that it's raining is going to grab an umbrella. It depends, for example, on whether you want to get wet. If you don't want to get wet, then you're apt to carry an umbrella. If you do want to get wet, then you're apt to not carry an umbrella. And so this project of linking a particular mental state with particular behaviors just isn't going to work. It's much more holistic than that. I think plausibly something similar is true of Qbl. When you're like, I want to live, whether you're disposed to say, I want to live, depends on things like whether you believe that if a tiger hears you, it's apt to eat you. So there's not going to be a straightforward mapping between Qbl, particular ascriptions of Qbl, and particular dispositions to behave. Anyway, so I want to claim. Maybe this would be another good, so at this point, we've tried to argue that Qbl isn't reducible to says and thinks, to these ordinary kind of direct discourse locutions. It's its own kind of thing. And then in the next sections, we're going to consider some strategies for theorizing about it. But maybe this would be a good place to pause and see if there are any questions. Yeah, Jean?
Yeah, I don't know why I can't raise my hand, but anyway. Well, what I was thinking is, it seems that sort of, as you sort of finished on, QBL doesn't really fall into the category of reporting, the same way that direct discourse, for example, or indirect discourse would. The example of the gestures, shows that, and the example of irony shows that as well. Could it be that maybe there's a different way of interpreting QBL as a sort of imitation, sort of like a more efficient way of, so if I were to, like the soundtrack example, and I thought God was an awful soundtrack. If I were to sort of say it in a more formal way using direct discourse or indirect discourse, or, sort of explaining, describing the proposition attitudes that sort of Ellen had at this time, it would be longer. But if I were to use QBL, it's a more efficient, faster way of sort of, as if when I use QBL at that moment, I become the individual, like imitate, the individual I am reporting on.
Yeah, good. So I think this is closely related to something that we're going to discuss in the next section. So one thing I want to say is hold this thought.
Sorry.
But another thing that I want to say is I think that is promising, but I think I'd like to hear more about the relevant notion of imitation, because something about that seems right. But if you imagine, the monk who has taken a vow of silence, and I say, he's like, I'm out of here. He's not saying anything. So what's the sense in which I'm imitating him? Don't want to suggest that there is no way of answering that question, but it does seem like there's a kind of, like, that's a promising view that the details need to be filled in. But I agree, actually, and so again, so we're going to discuss a view kind of in this vicinity in the next section. But I think that there's probably a better version of the view that we're going to discuss in the next section along the lines of what you're suggesting. That is probably one of the main kind of candidates for being the right view. We just haven't really worked out the details yet. Let's see, Robert?
Yeah, hello. So I am actually now starting to buy that QBL might be something different to like Thurs. But I was just looking at 7b, and I was wondering whether that really is the same sort of thing. Like it seems like that's an instruction that demonstrates like what one should do, rather than like reporting what happened or what might have happened, or it just seems like it's something different. It's telling someone to do something rather than saying what someone did.
I see. That's a good point. So that might not be an instance of QBL. So the other use of like in English, or another use of like in English that I didn't really mention, is its use as well, I guess there are a couple of relevant uses. Sorry, there are a couple of relevant uses, but uses where it attributes a similarity. And maybe, so what you're suggesting is that 7b isn't an example of QBL, but it's saying something like, when you see him after his recital, make yourself similar to this.
Yeah. Or reassure him in some way,
Yeah. That's a good point. That might be right. That's plausible. Yeah. Sorry, I don't have anything good to say about that, but I think you might be right about that case. I mean, it is interesting to think about. Well, so here's something to say about that might or might not be interesting, but there are a variety of these kinds of constructions even in English. So to be all is another example that's closely related to be like, but doesn't look so there, this connection to similarity isn't there. It isn't so apparent. I think that this example, I mean, I agree that it's not a declarative. It's a kind of command or a request. So to that extent, it's different. But nonetheless, we need to give a kind of compositional story about how commands and requests and things work too. And I do think that it works. So you could say when you see him after his recital, just be all, and that's okay too. So it isn't just about similarity. Yeah, but nonetheless, you might be right about this case. Yeah, Gareth?
Yeah, thanks. I just wonder, is there a sense in which it somehow allows the person reporting this thing to kind of abstract from, as you were saying, the sort of particular circumstances, or even the particular manifestation of a or whatever you call it, of a disposition in that person, where you're making, you know, I was like in a general state of surprise that could apply to other situations, that therefore make it more easy for the listener to understand, because it's a sort of general surprise, or, you know, head slap moment, or
yeah, yeah. So that sounds plausible. I guess I'd like to hear more about how to kind of cash that out and make that what you're suggesting precise. So, you know, it could be. I mean, I can imagine this as a version of a kind of dispositional view, like, you know, I was in a state that of a kind that makes people disposed to say, or to, you know, to do that. Okay, and that's attributing a kind of disposition. It's abstracting away from the details of that state. Maybe it's abstract in some. I'm not sure if abstracting away is quite the right word for it, but it's at least it's not talking about what that person in fact did, or the details of their behavior, or aspects of their mental state other than whatever it is that's generating this disposition in them. So so I think some of these views that we've been discussing have points of contact with what you're saying. If there is another view, or yeah, if there's another view in the vicinity here, it would be interesting to hear what, in more detail, what it is. Yeah. Victor?
Yes. So I was wondering about a possible commonality between the discourse article use of like and quotative be like. So I'm not a native English speaker, but I always felt that a central use of the discourse article like was used somehow to qualify your assertion, or to be somehow a bit non-committal about what you're expressing through the conventional meaning of your word, because you could probably replace it with like with sort of, and maybe if you say Ellen was like frustrated, maybe you can't be held accountable if she was more disappointed actually than frustrated. And I wonder if that was related to the looseness of the report of the quotative be like. So because you could say be like to report what was said, but maybe also that would be correct to report what was conveyed, implicated but not actually said.
Yeah, that's an interesting suggestion. So that that does kind of ring true about the discourse particle use, at least in a lot of uses. I think it doesn't always work that way. One of our examples is he was wearing this like really pink shirt. I think there you need not be, and you're not kind of naturally understood as communicating any kind of uncertainty or imprecision or whatever about the pinkness of the shirt, or it's more like, if anything, kind of the opposite of that. It's like drawing attention to the pinkness of the shirt. But I agree that in a lot of cases, what you're saying rings true. That suggests that there's more to it than focus, which I think is something that hasn't, I may not be fully up to date on this, but that hasn't really been appreciated in the kind of linguistics literature about this. So that is interesting, and it does. Yeah, I mean, it could be that's going to play some role in explaining the kind of perceived looseness of Qbl ascriptions too. Even, I mean, maybe an interesting question whether that would be a kind of semantic role or a kind of meta-semantic role, just that people had this association with that word, and so the properties of the one use rubbed off on the properties of the other use. Yeah, I'm not sure, but that is, yeah, it's something to think about. And I'd like to think more about that feature of the discourse particle-like as well. I'm not quite sure what to think about that.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Any other questions here? Should we move on? Let's see. Okay, so moving on then. The next thing we're going to do is consider some other ways of trying to account for Qbl, and some of these have points of contact with some of the things that Jean and others have suggested in questions. So one thing that the sociolinguistics literature that I cited in the beginning that shows that Qbl ascriptions are so common shows is that this is an important part of folk psychology. So it seems like, you know, this is playing an important role in how we're thinking about people's minds and people's behaviors and things like that. And so what we want to consider now is some strategies that are familiar from older philosophy of mind literature for accounting for belief and desire within the context of folk psychology. One other thing that's just worth observing here, it's often been thought, particularly in debates about eliminativism about mental states, that folk psychology is kind of stagnant or a degenerating research program or something like that, a kind of bad, refuted theory, and not just bad, but uncorrectably bad, that doesn't improve itself. It seems to me that that's not right, in part because Qbl is new. We didn't have this in English up until 40 years ago or so, at least as far as the sociolinguists can tell. And it does seem like it's something that provides novel expressive resources. So I think when Paul Churchland says that that folk psychology hasn't changed since the time of the ancient Greeks or something like that, I don't think that's quite right. But anyway, that's by the way. One famous kind of account of belief and desire in this area is Dennett's. So Dennett sees belief and desire ascriptions as an important part of a strategy for predicting the behavior of things. So here's a famous passage from Dennett. He says, "All there is to being a true believer something that genuinely has beliefs, that belief ascriptions are genuinely true of, is being a system whose behavior is reliably predictable via the intentional strategy. That is to say, by attributing beliefs and desires to the thing and deriving predictions about what it'll do on the basis of those beliefs and desires. And hence, all there is to really and truly believing that P, for any proposition P, is being an intentional system for which P occurs as a belief in the best, most predictive interpretation. So what he's saying is, there's really no crucial difference as far as belief desire psychology goes between you and me and the chess playing computer who we can predict what it's going to do by attributing the desire to get its queen out early. That is a perfectly legitimate way to predict its behavior, and because it is, belief and desire ascriptions are literally true of it in just the same way they're true of us. Okay, so now you might think that's a view of folk psychology. Folk psychology is in the business of predicting people via this intentional strategy. And Qbl is a part of folk psychology, so it must be playing some kind of role in predicting people's behavior. Now, what we've already said suggests that that role is going to have to be complicated because there's no direct link between a particular Qbl ascription, like he was like, I'm out of here, and a particular behavior like saying, I'm out of here. Those links to behavior are always going to be mediated by other kinds of mental states, beliefs and desires, and so on. That was the Chisholm point. So it seems like if Qbl is going to play a role in the prediction of behavior, it's going to have to be in conjunction with other kinds of attitudes, like presumably beliefs and desires. Now, if you think about the way that the Dennett kind of strategy here is supposed to work, you're supposed to be able to attribute something some basic beliefs based on the kind of experiences that it's had, the kind of situation that it's in, kind of perception that's available to it. And then you're supposed to extend those basic beliefs on the basis of reasoning. And so it's important that what goes into beliefs and likewise desires, you're supposed to be able to predict behavior in part because you know that things will show a certain amount of means ends rationality. So if they want to do X and they think that Y is the way to do X, then they're likely to do Y, that kind of thing. So if you want to predict something's behavior, you need the things that are entering into these Dennett style, this Dennett style strategy to be proposition kind of things that are the subject of reasoning. You need to be able to get from the basic beliefs to more complicated kinds of beliefs. You need to be able to get from the beliefs and desires to intentions to act via this kind of practical instrumental reasoning. But the problem with extending this to Qbl, something we've already hit on, it seems like objects of Qbl just don't have the right kind of logical structure to enter into this kind of reasoning and this kind of explanation. So here's the thing. I think the gesture examples we've already talked about are good examples of this kind of thing, but here's another example. Sue was like, wow. Okay. That's a perfectly legitimate ascription of Qbl. It makes sense. And I think it might play some kind of role in what we would expect Sue to do, or at least how we would expect, like what we would expect about Sue's mind at the time. But it doesn't look like it can enter into these Dennett kind of explanations of behavior. It's just not, it just doesn't fit inferentially with beliefs and desires in the right kind of way. So I don't think that Qbl ascriptions are going to play into these kinds of explanations of behavior in this way. Really, it seems like that's not really what they're about. Like if I say Sue was like, wow, it doesn't seem like, at least in a lot of cases, it doesn't seem like what I'm trying to get you to do, or what I'm trying to give you is some information you can use to predict her behavior. It seems like maybe more I'm telling you about she's like experiencing some wonder and astonishment and things like that. More like phenomenally conscious or emotional kinds of states than propositional attitude kind of states. So that seems like maybe some kind of data point about QBL. Now, there are other ways of thinking about folk psychology than Dennett's, and other ways that maybe make more room or more neatly encompass other non-propositional kinds of states. So a general framework for thinking about this is simulationism. This is the idea that our folk psychological attributions and predictions of behavior use the very mental apparatus that generates our own behavior. It just kind of uses it offline, as they say, in a way that's not actually connected to our behavior. So if I want to know what you will do on this kind of view, what I do is, in effect, plug in the beliefs and desires I think you have into the very mechanism that generates my own actions in place of my own beliefs and desires, and kind of run that offline and see what results, see what I would do under those kind of circumstances. Okay, so that's suggestive, and I think this, especially in combination with the kind of thought that Jean was having, suggests that maybe what QBL is doing is playing a kind of role in mental simulation. So here's a first shot at incorporating that and developing that into a view of QBL. What QBL is giving you is a kind of invitation to imagine. It's giving you a prop for imagining or simulating the person you're talking about. So X was like S is an invitation to simulate X using S as a prop. It's in effect saying, plug wow into your simulation mechanism and see what comes out. Okay, well, I think that there is something plausible about this idea. But I don't think that the QBL as invitation to imagine, as stated, is going to do. And that's because it's subject to, in effect, a famous kind of objection that's often posed against emotivist views of normative language. That is the Frege-Geach objection. So the Frege-Geach objection says, so if you're familiar with this idea, the sort of most naive emotivist view is that saying that something is good or saying that it's bad isn't making any kind of claim about it, it's just expressing an emotion about it. So saying that murder is bad is saying boo, murder. And that's not even a truth evaluable kind of thing, it's just a kind of expression of emotion. And then the Frege-Geach objection is that these kinds of locutions enter into linguistic environments that seem to require them to have truth values and express propositions and things like that. So things like the antecedent of conditionals. So you can say, if murder is wrong, then Timmy shouldn't murder. And that makes perfectly good sense, but if boo murder, then Timmy shouldn't murder just is nonsense. So the antecedent of a conditional seems to require something truth evaluable, seems to require a kind of proposition or something like that, and this naive emotivist view isn't giving you that. Likewise, QBL as invitation to imagine isn't giving you that. So what QBL as invitation to imagine is suggesting is that saying S is like S, X is like S, is just inviting you to simulate X. But an invitation is not a truth evaluable kind of thing. It's not a proposition. So it looks like this isn't giving you the kind of thing that should be able to appear in the antecedent of conditionals and things like that. But QBL ascriptions can appear there. So you can say, if she's like then you should seriously consider it. You can also directly attribute truth and falsity to these things. You can say, if someone says, then she was like, I'm out of here. Someone can respond, no, that's not true. She wanted to stay. Now, okay, there's a big literature about this in metaethics, and there are sophisticated expressivist kind of views that are designed precisely to resist, to kind of preserve the inside of emotivism while resisting this kind of objection. I don't want to really get into that, in part just because I think QBL's invitation to imagine isn't really motivated by simulationism. Simulationism is a view of how folk psychology works. It's a kind of empirical claim about psychology, about how humans deal with each other, maybe also about the epistemology of other minds construed in a certain way. But it's in itself neutral on the metaphysics of mental states and also on the semantics of mental state ascriptions. So, for example, simulationists about belief might think that belief ascriptions really ascribe a two-place relation between a person and a proposition, and it's a matter of fact, independent of psychological theorizing, whether people stand in those relations or not. So in other words, the proponent of simulationism about belief need not accept something like the idea that belief ascriptions are invitation to imagine. Likewise, I think the proponent of simulationism about QBL could accept in principle a wide range of views about what exactly is going on with QBL ascriptions and the states ascribed by them. So what I want to do in this last section is just to talk a little bit about some claims about the semantics and metaphysics of QBL. Now, I think there are basically two ways of thinking about what's going on with QBL ascriptions. One would be to say, well, we can reduce QBL to other kinds of states, to says and thinks or something similar. Maybe we haven't seen exactly the right way to do that. Maybe we'll need to invoke, for example, notions of imitation or similarity, the kinds of things that some of you were gesturing at a minute ago. That's not something that we address in detail in this draft of the paper. So that's one kind of project, reducing QBL to something else. But another kind of project is taking QBL ascriptions more like at face value and looking at the features of them and trying to decide what kind of state is ascribed by them. So our analog here is thinking about the semantics of belief reports. So here's a kind of generic view, kind of standard view that a lot of ways of filling in the details, even views like Dennett's may accept something like this. X believes that P is true if and only if X stands in the belief relation to P. And then there are good questions about what is the belief relation, what does it take to stand into the belief relation to a particular proposition, or what kind of thing is P, and so on and so on. Okay. You can have different views about that and still accept this kind of generic semantics. So here's an analogous proposed generic semantics for QBL. X is like S is true if and only if X stands in the B-like relation to S. And that's going to provoke analogous kind of questions about the nature of the B-like relation. What kind of a relation is it? What are its formal features? What does it take to stand in the B-like relation to a given S? And also questions about the nature of S, of the relata of the B-like relation. So I'm just going to say a little bit about some possibilities for thinking in this way about QBL ascriptions. And then I'll stop. So First, some basic kind of formal features of the be-like relation. On its face, be-like looks like a two-place relation. It looks like it's relating a thinker, X, to a, well, a good question, we'll come back to that in a minute, to a thing that's expressed by a quotation or a gesture, S. Now, belief also looks like a two-place relation, but some people have doubted that it is, in fact, a two-place relation. And there are a few different ways this might go. There's like the Russellian multiple relation view of belief. Just going to set that aside. One prominent reason to think that beliefs might be a three-place relation is because belief reports have this kind of fineness of grain. So we're all familiar with these kind of Frege cases, Frege's puzzle about belief. It can be true that Lois believes that Superman flies, but it is, or at least certainly seems false, that Lois believes that Clark Kent flies. And of course, there are various ways of thinking about or addressing the problem posed by that. But one way of addressing it is to think that, in fact, beliefs is a three-place relation that relates a thinker, a proposition, and a mode of presentation. The mode of presentation being supplied by a hidden indexical or something like that. That could explain how a sentence like 14a is true, while 14b is false. They both relate the same thinker and the same proposition, but different modes of presentation that are supplied contextually in virtue of the different word choice in the two sentences. Okay. Does something like this way of thinking motivate a three-place view of be-like? Well, we think not, although it is true that it could be the case that Lois was like Superman flies, but not the case that Lois was like Clark Kent flies. So that's true. There is this kind of failure of substitutivity. But that's really not surprising because everyone grants that co-referential expressions can't be substituted into quotations in other kinds of contexts. So for example, Lois said, quote, Superman flies is not equivalent to Lois said, quote, Clark Kent flies. And in general, I think the way people want to explain this kind of sensitivity, or sorry, this kind of substitutivity failure is by appealing to a claim about the metaphysics of quotation, or what is what is expressed by quotations in these kinds of contexts. What kind of entity is picked out by quotations in these kind of contexts. If the entity picked out by, quote, Superman flies is distinct from the entity picked out by, quote, Clark Kent flies, then there's no problem. Now, there are different ways of thinking about what is picked out by quotation expressions. Some people think they are linguistic types or linguistic tokens, and there are just a variety of different kinds of options in the literature. Some people think there's a kind of context sensitivity here, that they pick out different kinds of things in different contexts. I don't quite know what to think about that. But I just want to mention a couple of constraints on what I think has to be going on in the case of be-like. One is that whatever it is that is picked out by quotation in the case of be-like, it's not going to be a truth condition or something that has truth conditions like a proposition. And that's just true because of the kind of examples we've seen before, like Sue is like, wow, possibly also gestural kinds of examples. Okay, so it's not proposition, it's not a propositional attitude. Second kind of constraint is whatever the object of be-like ascriptions is, whatever the thing that is related to people by the be-like relation, it's the kind of thing that can be referred to by a gesture as well as purely linguistic quotation. So I don't think it can be a linguistic type or something like that, which is again one of the prominent views in the literature on direct discourse. I mentioned earlier in response to Simon this Catherine Davidson view that what is picked out by these quotation expressions and also by gestures is a demonstration. And something like that is probably a plausible view, although again, I don't know exactly what a demonstration is. So it would be, I'd feel better about endorsing that view if I really understood it. Okay, so those are the basic kind of formal features of the be-like relation, or those are our observations about them. So the second kind of question is, what kind of relation is this? Like, what does it take to stand in the be-like relation to a certain quotation or a certain demonstration or whatever it is? Just going to consider briefly two kinds of proposals here, inconclusively. One kind of view would be functionalist. So we're all familiar with this kind of view about belief and desire. And it's motivated by some of the same kinds of observations against behaviorism that we discussed earlier in this talk. So it would make sense if, in response to the analogous kind of points about be-like, somebody wanted to try to develop a functionalist view of be-like. So what this would require is locating states like the state of being like I'm leaving now in a network of other mental states and describing the causal relations between those states. So describing how the state of being like I'm leaving now relates to beliefs and desires and also behaviors and perceptions and so on. So for example, somebody might say the state of being like I'm leaving now is that state which is typically caused by the desire to leave, and which, in the absence of the desire to be silent, the desire to be ironical, and so on, causes utterances of I'm leaving now. Now, obviously, this is a hopelessly underdeveloped sketch, but I hope you get the idea of how a functionalist might think about this kind of thing. Now, I said functionalism is a familiar kind of view, and a lot of people still think something in this ballpark is plausible about beliefs and desires, I think. But there are some traditional objections to functionalism, and I think that they are objections that bite harder about be-like functionalism than they bite against belief-desire functionalism. And possibly this is because be-like states seem perhaps more closely linked to phenomenal states than functionalists about belief typically conceive of beliefs as being linked to phenomenal states. So one kind of objection related to things we've already discussed is that it's hardly clear that there's a unique functional role played by the state of being like I'm leaving now in everyone who is like I'm leaving now. This is in general a problem about functionalism. You have to say what everyone who believes that it's raining has in common. And it's not clear you're going to be able to do that because different people have different kinds of idiosyncratic associations with that belief, different kinds of misconceptions about rain, and so on. Likewise, considering vows of silence and all the kind, all of the things we've considered, it's hardly going to be clear that there is a kind of unique functional state, a unique functional role played by this state in everyone who has it. Now, functionalists may think they have a recipe for giving one. So I'm going to mention another kind of challenge to functionalism. Again, it's a challenge that, that has been posed against functionalism about propositional attitudes like belief and desire. In that case, I think it's typically meant to be answered by a kind of conceptual role theory. And I don't see I think it's going to be more difficult to do that kind of thing in the case of Qbl. So the objection is Qbl ascriptions are productive. So it's not as though there's only a fixed finite list of them that we understand. You can put more or less anything into a quotation and get some idea of what it would be like to be like that, so to speak. So, you know, it's not just like we understand being like, I'm leaving now, and being like, it's raining and that's it. We can come up with loads of novel gestures and novel quotations and so on, and those will be appropriate to describe someone's mental state using Qbl in different kinds of contexts. So it's not enough to give a functionalist account of particular states. We need a kind of general recipe of how to go from a quotation or a gesture to a kind of functional role. And I just really don't see how to do that. Again, maybe the clever functionalists will have a strategy here, but it looks like a difficult task. Okay, one last proposal that I'd like to discuss that I think is, just because I think in some ways this is, once you've exhausted all the other options, this looks like a kind of attractive possibility. So if you think about the literature about knowledge ascriptions, for a long time people tried to analyze knowledge ascriptions, and that was really hard. There were counterexamples to every possibility. And so then some people, perhaps most notably Tim Williamson, suggested that in fact knowledge is not analyzable. It's just its own kind of state. You can't boil it down into other kinds of states because it just is what it is. It's knowledge, and it's the thing that you use to analyze other things. Now you might think, if you've given up on analyzing Qbl in terms of says and thinks, and you've given up on Dennettian interpretivism, and you've given up on functionalism, you're kind of running low on options, and you might just think, well, okay, maybe Qbl is just its own thing, not analyzable in terms of other things. Well, that's a kind of nice solution to any problem, I think. But what would be really interesting, I think, and this is something I just don't know how to do. So Williamson doesn't just say what knowledge isn't. He gives a kind of positive account of knowledge as the most basic fact of mental state, and shows what that account can do. So it's not as though we just can't say anything about knowledge on this kind of view. Likewise, I think this unanalyzable view would be interesting if we could say something about what Qbl is. And I'm really not sure how to do that, but I think that's the challenge for developing this kind of view. Okay, so that's the end. Just to sum some of this up, I think that Qbl is really interesting. It's not just equivalent to other kinds of direct discourse locutions. It's not straightforwardly analyzable in those terms. And then I think there's a kind of methodological question here. So one way of theorizing about this would be to try to do more and bring fancier tricks to break, to analyze Qbl in terms of says and things or related things. Another kind of thing would be to go more philosophy of mind and do more of the kind of thing that we're doing in the last section of this paper, to think about the be-like relation itself and try and say something more substantive about what that relation is, or to give a functionalist, for example, or other kind of theory of it. I don't really know methodologically which of those is the better strategy. But I think in a way that's the interesting puzzle that's been that's posed by reflecting on these Qbl ascriptions. So I guess with that I can stop and and take some more questions. So Victor, is that a new hand or is that still your previous hand?
No, sorry, I forgot to unraise it, lower it.
No worries. Lara?
Yeah, hi. Thank you. This was so interesting. So, okay. I have multiple thoughts. I'll try to keep it to one. Okay, my main one. Have you thought that maybe the appearance of the be-like quotative thing from the 80s might coincide with the appearance of sign language being broadcasted on TV? Because it's really the time when like sign language became like way more popular. And I'm thinking, given the whole like, the fact that be-like quotatives are really like also visual and like emotional and kind of like embodied, and it's not just like, and as you said it, we cannot replace it by said.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm wondering if also it might be something, as you know, we steal stuff from other languages all the time. So maybe actually the be-like quotatives could be something that we might have stolen from sign language.
That's a really interesting possibility. I think I mentioned that that Davidson does associate these quotatives with various sign language locutions. So I don't think she makes that kind of historical conjecture, as far as I remember anyway. But that's an interesting possibility.
Because yeah. That could
I mean, it is interesting because I think that the widespread use of discourse particle-like grew about the same time, maybe a little bit earlier. I've seen. I think this may be in part due to the prominence of the Frank Zappa song "Valley Girl" and other kinds of reflections of Valley Girl culture. But that's a kind of, again, some speculation that I've read without any kind of serious evidence about it. But yeah, that's a really interesting possibility.
Can I just add a little other things? I don't know how many people have their hands raised. Oh no, there's too many people. Okay, I'm done. Thank you.
Simon?
Yeah, I really enjoyed the talk. I might not be understanding what it is that you're finding difficult about the notion of a demonstration in here. And in the way I'm thinking of it at the moment, this is connected with another issue which concerns which problems you need to solve and which ones you can pass on to somebody else who's working on other things. So let me try and suggest an answer to both things simultaneously, just by telling you the way I'm thinking about it, and you can tell me if this is wrong. So I'm imagining that X was like S could be understood as meaning something like, here is what X was like, or X was like this. And then there follows a performance. And the word this in X was like this, the this refers to that performance. So that's where the demonstrative gets into it, or the here. And then the performance conveys what X was like. And okay, there's a whole story to be said about performance and theatre and how theatre conveys things. And I'm sure that's a huge, complicated story that many people are working on. And you can imagine all sorts of things that go on in theatre that would address some of the problem cases that you came up with, like the monk who has made a vow of silence. But you can imagine somebody acting the role of that monk, saying things to the audience, like, I'm not supposed to speak here, or something like that. And no doubt there's a need for a theory like that, but I'm wondering whether you need to come up with that theory for your project, or whether you can say, look, as far as the philosophy of language issue is concerned, you're just pointing to this performance that follows the word like, and then people in aesthetics or whatever the field would be can tell us about how that works.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So on the issue about demonstrations, I think that there are two there are two kind of uses of the term demonstration in the vicinity here, and I agree, and I would think I was conflating them to some extent. So I think what is a bit puzzling is a view like, again, this Catherine Davidson view that I mentioned. As I read her, so she just gives a formal semantics without kind of filling in the metaphysical details very much, but she thinks that that be like, and also says, and things like that, ascribe a two-place relation between a thinker or speaker and a demonstration. And if that's the view, then I want to know what a demonstration is. I think what you're suggesting is, just as if you say belief is a two-place relation between a thinker and a proposition, I think it's legitimate to ask, what is a proposition? If you're thinking, well, I guess, your kind of paratactic inspired view would say be like is a kind of ascription of similarity. And so you say you're like that, and that can really be anything. It's just an entity of some kind, maybe typically a performance, but in principle, I could say, you're like this, and I don't know what I mean by that, but you get the idea. It's not kind of semantically or metaphysically or anything different from that. And in that case, I mean, sure, I guess there are puzzles still about demonstration, but I agree that then that is not something that I would need to be particularly worried about. In terms of the point about who's responsible for what, that's a good question. I don't know. I mean, in a way, I kind of, I guess I hadn't really thought about it in quite those terms, and maybe I should have a kind of better sense of what my aim is here in theorizing about this thing, so I can tell when I have met it. I mean, I guess in a way I'm hesitant to kind of just push these jobs off into some other subdiscipline or whatever and call it a day. That feels unsatisfying, but at the same time, I take your point, I guess. So I'm not quite sure what to say about that.
Just a final thought in case it helps, or might give you a whole new problem. It just suddenly occurred to me that there's a plural case as well. We or they were like this, were like, and you can imagine sort of two people telling you the story of what happened, and they say, oh, we were like this, and then the two of them act out something together, playing different roles in it.
That's really interesting. Yeah. Yeah, good. I don't know but that's a really good case.
It would fit the notion of a performance. That's what I was thinking, I suppose.
Yeah, good. Interestingly, there's also this impersonal be-like construction where you can say things like, I walked into the room and it was like, yuck, this stinks. Not I was like, but it was like. And it seems like I don't know quite what to think about this, but it seems like the suggestion there is more like this is like how anyone would react on coming into the room, or it's just kind of the appropriate reaction. Yeah, so, well, anyway, yeah. Nick?
Hey, you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, I had a microphone issue the other day, so I wanted to double check that first before I went into Qbl. So I was also thinking about the origins of the phrase and the timing a bit like Lara, and while thinking about that, I also came across the same Valley Girls thing that you mentioned in the passing. But I've got a number of thoughts. The main thing is that I am skeptical that this type of usage only begins in the 1980s. And I think that it might be quite useful, given that there's definitely going to be some pragmatic elements to how it's being used because of all of these different uses and how it's become slang that got adopted into language more generally. It's probably going to be useful finding that exact beginning. And one way of doing that potentially would be looking through song lyrics from the 1970s or before to see if there's any uses of it like that. I found a few references when just having a quick Google, but I couldn't clarify anything because the songs were old enough that people didn't list the lyrics for them, so you'd have to listen to the songs, unfortunately. But in the course of that, I came across an article that you might be interested in. You might have already read it, but it's called I'm Like, Say What? A New Quotative in American Oral Narrative by Carl Blythe, Jenny Wang, and Sigrid Rechtenwald. And it has, I just had a cursory look over it just now, and it has a lot of interesting discussion, some of which is touching on what you're saying, some of it is not, has got some extra elements. And another really interesting extra element, which was also in the back of my mind, but I think they put it better than I would, is there's this class undertone to the notion of be like. And in particular, I don't know whether they were using their own study or whether they were referencing someone else's study, but a study was done where they asked various participants about the phrase be like, and most of them tended to associate it with Valley Girl slang or Valspeak, or at least they associated it with working classes or non-white communities, and also associated similar pejoratives that they associated to those communities with this usage, even if the person running the study